The opening ceremony was simple. No speeches, no ribbon cutting. Just people, artists, architects, dreamers walking quietly through the space Evelyn had imagined and I had finished. Someone asked me afterward, "Mr. Hale, how does it feel to complete her work?" I looked around at the building glowing softly in twilight. "I didn't complete it," I said. "I continued it." Later that night, as the last guests left, I stayed behind. The sanctuary was empty, moonlight streaming through the open roof. I sat on the floor, back against the stone, and let the silence do what words couldn't. For years, my story had been about winning, then about forgiving. Now, it was simply about building, quietly. And somewhere above, through that open square of sky, I imagined her voice amused, proud and free. "You finally learned how to stop finishing everything." I smiled. Maybe perfection wasn't completion. Maybe it was peace. They called it the Day of Light. I hadn't chosen the name someone in the Lisbon press had. It spread so quickly that by the time I read about it, the words had already become a banner. The sanctuary opened to the world on the first spring morning after completion. People came from every continent: architects, artists, philosophers, even politicians who wanted to be photographed beside meaning. But when the sun broke through the clouds that morning, illuminating the courtyard, it wasn't grandeur that filled the air. It was peace. No one spoke. The silence itself became language. The opening wasn't just an event, it was ignition. Within weeks, news outlets around the world ran stories about the Hale Sanctuary. Students quoted Evelyn's design principles. Universities began offering seminars titled Empathy in Space. Public forums debated the ethics of architecture and emotion. And for the first time, I realized something both humbling and terrifying. Evelyn and I had built something unstoppable, something we could no longer curate. In London, the fellowship studio buzzed like a nerve. Leah and Adrian coordinated exhibitions, digital archives, collaborations with NGOs. They were radiant, alive with purpose. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt displaced. At night, I sat by my office window, watching the glow of the city and wondering whether peace and purpose could coexist. Was I watching my creation evolve, or watching myself fade from relevance? It was an absurd thought, childish even. But truth, I've learned, isn't always mature. One afternoon, Adrian burst into my office, excitement spilling from him like caffeine. "They want us in Geneva," he said. "UNESCO's hosting a summit on ethical design. They're dedicating a session to the sanctuary." I nodded slowly. "You'll go." He blinked. "Me? They invited you." "I've already said everything that needs saying. It's time someone else spoke." He frowned. "You're not retiring, are you?" I smiled faintly. "No, just making room for the future." He hesitated, then grinned. "You sound like her." "I hope so," I said. "But letting go isn't a single act. It's a slow unbuilding, layer by layer, brick by brick. Every week, I received new invitations, lectures, panels, interviews. Every week, I declined. My place, I decided, was in the background. Let the next generation claim the stage. I'd already had my spotlight. Still, there were moments when the silence pressed too tightly against my chest. Moments when I'd catch an article quoting Evelyn or me and think, "We've become slogans." Once, that would have enraged me. Now, it just made me smile sadly. Every idea eventually outgrows its author. A few months after the opening, I returned to Lisbon. The sanctuary had become a pilgrimage site. Artists sketched in the gardens. Writers read poetry in the open hall. Children chased each other between the columns. The building wasn't solemn anymore. It was alive, messy, unpredictable, joyful, exactly as Evelyn had intended. I walked through the space quietly, unnoticed, until I reached the courtyard. There, a group of students from the fellowship were teaching a workshop. Among them was Isabella, older now, confident, her voice carrying with warmth. She was explaining the purpose of imperfection in design. "Evelyn Hale believed a wall should breathe," she said. "Marcus Hale taught that it should listen." The students scribbled notes, heads nodding. I smiled. They didn't know I was there, and I didn't interrupt, because for the first time, it didn't feel like my lesson anymore. It felt like theirs. Later that evening, Isabella found me sitting by the fountain near the entrance. "I thought that was you," she said, smiling. "You still walk like a man measuring the ground." "Occupational hazard," I said. She sat beside me. We've started getting visitors from Cairo, Mumbai, Sao Paulo. Everyone wants to build their own version of the sanctuary. And how do you feel about that? Excited, she said. Terrified. I keep thinking, how do we protect something meant to be shared? I looked at the water shimmering in the fountain. You don't. You guide it until it doesn't need guarding. Easier said than done. Everything worth doing is. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, You know, they're calling this the Hail movement. I grimaced. That sounds like a marketing department's idea of holiness. She laughed. Maybe. But it's real, Marcus. People are designing with compassion again. Cities are rethinking public space. You did this. No, I said. We did this. And now you have to carry it. She looked at me curiously. Are you leaving again? Not leaving. Just stepping aside. Why? Because movements aren't meant to orbit one person. They're constellations. I'm just one star that burned early. She studied me, her expression somewhere between admiration and sadness. You make peace sound lonely. I smiled. Sometimes it is, but it's also honest. That night, I stayed in the guest quarters at the sanctuary. The moonlight streamed through the skylight, painting soft lines across the bed. For a long time, I couldn't sleep. I thought about Evelyn, about how she'd never see this, and yet somehow had. I thought about Adrian and Isabella, about Leah, about all the people who'd inherited fragments of my once broken ambition and turned them into art. And I realized something simple, something I'd spent a lifetime resisting. Legacy isn't permanence. It's participation. It isn't being remembered. It's being continued. When morning came, I walked through the sanctuary one last time before my flight back to London. The halls echoed with footsteps, laughter, quiet conversation. Every sound felt like proof that we'd done something that would outlive explanation. At the exit, someone had placed a small brass plaque beside the gate. It read, Dedicated to Evelyn and Marcus Hale, who taught us that even ambition can learn to love. I stood there for a long moment, letting the sunlight wash over the words. Then I whispered, We didn't teach it. We just survived it. And I walked away not from the building, but from the need to own it. Peace is never permanent. It's a loan, not a gift. When I returned to London, the city looked cleaner but felt dirtier. Billboards that once advertised luxury cars now displayed digital renderings of minimalist, sustainable towers. Every one of them bore the same slogan, Inspired by the Hail movement. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I saw the names. Titan Developments, Wyndham, all of them the same corporations we'd fought in Lisbon. They'd waited for the silence of grief to move in like scavengers. Leah was already waiting in my office when I arrived. She didn't speak right away. She just slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, marketing materials, press releases, licensing agreements. Each one used our language. Words like compassionate design, architecture of empathy, spaces for renewal. But the images? Glass fortresses for billionaires, private sanctuaries for executives, gated versions of the very openness we'd built for the world. I closed the folder and took a slow breath. They've trademarked the phrase, the Hale standard, she said quietly. I looked up. They've turned legacy into a logo. Leah nodded. They're franchising empathy. The next day, my phone rang. It was Charles Wyndham. Of course, Marcus, he said cheerfully. You've seen the news, I assume? I have. Then you understand, we're only doing what you couldn't, making it global. I stared out the window at the skyline. You're selling spirituality by the square foot, he chuckled. People pay for peace, Marcus. We're just giving them a cleaner conscience with their penthouse view. You're corrupting what we built. I'm evolving it, he said. You had your noble phase. Now comes the profitable one. I didn't reply. He continued. We'd like you on the advisory board. Strictly honorary, of course. It'll look good on both sides. I almost laughed. That's the problem, Charles. You still think reputation is currency. And you think ideals can pay the bills. I've seen ideals rebuild lives, I said. He sighed. You've gone soft. No, I said. I've gone free. And I ended the call. For a week, I tried to ignore it. But everywhere I went, I saw their advertisements. The hail standard was spreading like wildfire from Dubai to New York, Tokyo to Cape Town, and each glossy image erased a little more of Evelyn's intention. Finally, Adrian stormed into my flat one night, phone in hand. "You've seen this?" he said, shoving the screen toward me. It was an article headline, "The Hail Standard, Luxury with a Conscience." The photos showed glass towers identical to Titan's old projects, just branded differently. "They're using your name to sell hypocrisy," Adrian said. "Not my name," I said. "Our name." He threw the phone onto the table. "Then do something." I shook my head. "It's their cycle now." "That's cowardice," he said sharply. I looked at him. Really looked. He wasn't angry for me. He was angry because of me. "You built an empire once," he said. "Then you dismantled it. Are you really going to let them rebuild it in your image?" He left before I could answer. That night, I found myself walking along the Thames, the city lights reflected in the dark water. Every tower looked like a mirror of regret, polished, hollow, endless. Evelyn once told me the problem with architecture is that it always assumes permanence. People don't. Maybe this was the final test of legacy, whether it could survive distortion. I returned home, poured a drink, and stared at the empty fireplace. For the first time in years, I felt the old anger again, not burning, but steady, focused. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted to outlast them. 2 days later, I met with Leah and Adrian. We sat in the Foundation's conference room, walls covered in blueprints and student sketches. I placed a folder on the table, Evelyn's final notes for the sanctuary. "We're going to publish this," I said. Leah blinked. "You want to release her private work?" "Yes. Open source. Free to everyone. Every design, every note, every detail, public domain." Adrian frowned. "That means anyone can use it." "Exactly," I said. "Because when everyone owns it, no one can exploit it." Leah's eyes widened. "You're countering corporate control with radical transparency." I smiled faintly. Evelyn believed that walls should breathe. So let's tear the last one down. The press called it the Great Release. The Foundation uploaded the entire Hail archive to the public. Blueprints, correspondences, philosophical essays, design patents, all under a Creative Commons license. Within days, the corporate trademark lost its value. Why buy exclusivity when the source material was free? Designers, students, and small firms began using the materials to build community centers, art schools, shelters. The real movement reawakened. And Titan's luxury sanctuaries? They became empty shells, expensive imitations of something that couldn't be bought. When the dust settled, I sat alone in the Foundation's garden, watching volunteers plant new saplings around the courtyard. Adrian joined me quietly. "You really think this will hold?" he asked. "No," I said. "But it'll breathe. That's enough." He nodded slowly. "You turned surrender into strategy." I smiled. "It's the only kind that lasts." Later that night, Leah found me still there, sketchbook in hand. "You know," she said, sitting beside me, "most people would have gone to court, sued, demanded damages. Revenge is expensive," I said. "Release is profitable in its own way." She laughed softly. "You and Evelyn, always making philosophy out of chaos. Someone has to. Do you ever think she'd be proud of what you did?" I looked up at the stars. She'd tell me it's about time I stopped trying to control everything. When she left, I stayed behind, staring at the saplings swaying in the night breeze. The garden lights flickered softly, casting golden halos on the new leaves. And I realized something Evelyn would have loved. By giving it all away, I'd made it eternal. Legacy wasn't ownership. It was oxygen. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was running out of breath. Fame dies quietly. It doesn't collapse in flames or applause. It simply fades, like the echo of your own footsteps when you've walked too far from the crowd. I liked it that way. By the time the Hail movement became a course at universities and a trending tag on social media, I was already gone from the stage. The Foundation ran itself. The fellowship had its own board, and I lived somewhere peace could finally find me. A small cottage in Sussex, wood smoke, lavender, and silence. For months, I didn't answer calls, didn't check email, didn't attend a single event. I gardened, cooked, watched the seasons change. It was enough. Until the letter arrived. It came from the Times of London. A young journalist, Clara Winslow. Mr. Hale, I'm writing a retrospective on the Hale movement. I'd like to meet you not for your story, but for your truth. I promise this isn't about empire. It's about empathy. 1 hour. At your convenience. I almost threw it away. But something about her phrasing, not for your story, but for your truth, stayed with me. I remembered being that age, chasing wisdom in other people's ruins. So I called her. We met at a small cafe near the coast. She arrived early, notebook already open, pen poised. Her hair was tied back, her expression alert but not aggressive. Mr. Hale, she said, rising to shake my hand. Thank you for coming. Marcus, I corrected. Mr. Hale sounds like he's about to lecture someone. She smiled. Marcus then. We sat. The sea wind rattled the windows softly. She began gently. What made you step away? The world still quotes you, studies you. I sipped my coffee. That's exactly why. When your voice starts echoing louder than your actions, it's time to stop talking. She jotted something down. You sound like someone at peace. I sound like someone who ran out of words, I said. She looked up. Do you regret anything? Everything, I said without hesitation. And nothing. It depends which day you ask. She leaned forward. Can I ask about Evelyn? I paused, then nodded. She seems to have shaped everything, your success, your downfall, your resurrection. I smiled faintly. She did. She always built in layers, even people. Clara hesitated, then said, You once told a lecture hall that ambition and empathy can't coexist. Do you still believe that? I thought for a moment. No, I said slowly. I think ambition needs empathy to survive. Otherwise, it collapses under its own weight. So, what was the sanctuary really about? Forgiveness, I said. Not hers. Mine. She looked surprised. Forgiving yourself? Yes. For mistaking recognition for purpose. For thinking success was something you stood on, instead of something you shared. She wrote quickly, then asked, Do you think Evelyn ever forgave herself? I looked out the window at the gray-blue sea. I think she built the sanctuary so she wouldn't have to answer that question. She was silent for a moment, then said softly, You talk about her like she's still here. She is, I said. Every time a child laughs in one of those gardens, every time a student sketches something with heart, that's her. I just built the walls. She filled them with light. Clara smiled. That's poetic. It's true. After a pause, she asked the question I hadn't been asked in years. What does success mean to you now? I laughed quietly. It used to mean skyscrapers. Then redemption. Now? I leaned back. Now it means waking up and not wanting to win anything. She nodded slowly, thoughtful. Do you ever miss the power? Power is an addiction, I said. You don't miss it. You just forget you're better without it. We sat in silence for a moment, the sound of waves filling the space between words. Then she asked, Do you mind if I record your answer to one last question? Go ahead. She clicked her phone recorder on. Marcus Hale, she said softly. What do you want people to remember you for? I looked at her, really. Looked the same way I once looked at a foundation, before the first stone. You're asking the wrong man, I said. I don't want to be remembered. She frowned slightly. Then what? I want to be continued. Clara stopped writing. Her expression softened. That's the most beautiful thing I've heard anyone say about legacy. I smiled. Legacy isn't beauty. It's surrender. She laughed gently. Do you realize how quotable you are? Bad habit, I said. Comes from years of pretending wisdom was armor. When the interview ended, she thanked me, promising to send a draft before publication. I watched her leave brisk, determined, pen still in motion. Some part of me envied her certainty, but mostly I felt gratitude, because she would tell our story better than I ever could, without bitterness, without myth, just humanity. Weeks later, her article appeared. The headline was simple. Marcus Hale, the man who built forgiveness. It was elegant, precise, almost unbearably honest. She hadn't romanticized me. She'd revealed me. She quoted one line in bold, the one readers repeated everywhere. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about being continued. For days, I received letters from students, architects, even strangers. Not praise, thanks. Simple, heartfelt notes from people who'd built something kinder because of what Evelyn and I had learned too late. I read every one. Then I burned them. Not out of disrespect, out of release, because some gratitude is meant to rise as smoke, not gather as trophies. That evening, I walked through the fields behind my cottage. The sky was bruised with twilight, the horizon burning faintly gold. I thought of Evelyn, of Adrian, of Isabella, of all the people who'd carried our mistakes forward and somehow turned them into lessons. And for the first time in years, I whispered aloud, not a prayer, not a confession, just acknowledgement. You were right. Buildings remember. People forgive. The wind stirred through the grass, gentle as breath. I smiled and kept walking. 10 years. That's how long it had been since the first sunrise over the sanctuary. 10 years since Evelyn's voice had last echoed in the courtyards. 10 years since I'd stood before a crowd and believed in beginnings. I'd thought time would dull it all, sand down the edges of memory until it became smooth enough to hold without bleeding. It hadn't. It had only made the silence louder. And then, one morning, a letter arrived, thick parchment, golden seal, Portuguese postage. Mr. Hale, on behalf of the Sanctuary Council, we invite you to the 10th anniversary of the Hale Foundation's opening. Your presence would honor us and her. With gratitude, Isabella Cruz, Director. There was a small note added at the bottom, written in her own hand. We finished your garden. The flight to Lisbon felt shorter this time, though the distance hadn't changed. The world below shimmered with the same blue it always had. I'd just learned to see it differently. When I arrived, the city looked new but familiar, old stone still wrapped in sun, tiled walls still catching the morning light. But the sanctuary was unrecognizable. What had once been a single retreat had grown into an entire campus, libraries, studios, open amphitheaters, even housing for visiting artists. It was no longer a place to escape the world. It had become a place to remake it. I stood at the entrance, tracing the brass plaque with my fingertips. The words were worn smooth by thousands of hands. Leave room for silence. The anniversary was not a celebration, it was a pilgrimage. Hundreds gathered from every continent. Students, designers, musicians, philosophers, architects, environmentalists, each one carrying something of Evelyn's and mine within them. And every corner of the sanctuary hummed with life. Children painted along the garden walls. Scholars debated beneath olive trees. A choir rehearsed in the open hall, their voices rising through the roofless ceiling and vanishing into the sky. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like a founder. I felt like a witness. I found Isabella near the reflecting pool, overseeing preparations for the ceremony. She looked older, more grounded, but still had that same luminous energy that made people move around her like planets around a sun. When she saw me, she broke into a grin. Marcus! We embraced, and for a brief moment, I saw the child from Brixton again, the one who'd once drawn cities out of crayons and hope. You finished the garden, I said. She smiled. Not finished, just evolved. Come see. She led me down a stone path to the south courtyard, where the garden spread wide under the morning light. It wasn't symmetrical like my designs. It wasn't even planned in any traditional sense. It was wild. Sunflowers leaned against sculptures. Vines crept across archways. Benches had been carved by hand from fallen trees. And at the center stood a sculpture, bronze, abstract, yet unmistakable. Two interlocking shapes, one curved, one angular, rising together like an unfinished circle. Beneath it, engraved in small letters, for Evelyn and Marcus, who taught us that even imperfection can be complete. I didn't speak, didn't need to. Isabella touched my arm. We didn't design this, she said softly. The students did. They wanted the garden to grow the way your story did, unexpectedly, painfully, beautifully. The ceremony began at dusk. The crowd filled the amphitheater overlooking the river, the same one Evelyn had once sketched in her last notebook. Isabella took the stage first. Her voice was calm but resonant. 10 years ago, this was one building. Today, it's a living philosophy. The sanctuary was never about walls or light. It was about the courage to start again. And we owe that courage to two people who proved that creation and forgiveness are the same art. Applause rippled through the audience. She turned to me. And now, the man who taught us that the truest architecture is the one that rebuilds the human heart, Marcus Hale. I stepped forward. The lights were warm, the faces countless. For a moment, My voice caught in my throat. Then I said quietly, Evelyn would have hated this spotlight. Laughter. A soft easing of tension. I continued, she used to say, buildings don't need applause, they just need to be used. If she could see this tonight, she wouldn't be proud of the speeches or the ceremony. She'd be proud of you, the people who took what we built and refused to let it end. The wind brushed across the amphitheater, carrying the scent of rain and orange blossoms. I looked out at the sea of faces and felt something I hadn't felt in years: completion without closure. I used to believe legacy was a monument, I said. But it's not. It's a movement, one that keeps walking long after its architects are gone. The crowd rose to their feet, not in applause, but in a quiet standing acknowledgement, like a collective exhale. After the ceremony, Isabella found me again by the garden. You said something tonight I want to remember forever, she said. That legacy keeps walking. It does, I said, and now it walks with you. She smiled, eyes glistening. Will you stay for a while? The students would love to learn from you again. I shook my head. They already have. They just don't know it. She laughed softly. Always the ghost in the foundation. Someone has to make sure the walls don't forget why they were built, I said. That night, I stayed in one of the guest rooms overlooking the river. The moonlight spilled across the floor like silver paint. I sat at the window, sketchbook open, pencil hovering above the page. For a long time, I didn't draw anything. Then, slowly, I began sketching the wild garden, messy, overgrown, alive. Not as an architect. As a man who'd finally learned that perfection wasn't design, it was surrender. When morning came, I left before dawn. No farewells, no photos, just a quiet walk through the garden one last time. At the exit gate, I stopped. Someone had placed a small sign there overnight, handwritten in charcoal, "Even silence leaves blueprints." I smiled. And as I stepped into the soft Lisbon sunrise, I whispered, "Goodbye, Evelyn. The walls remember." After Lisbon, I didn't go back to London. I went home, truly home, to Sussex. The cottage had always been temporary, a refuge between storms. But when I stepped through the door that night, I realized it had become something else. A final project, waiting to be understood. For decades, I'd built for everyone else. For clients, for cities, for redemption, for Evelyn. But never for me. I was a man surrounded by spaces I'd designed, yet I'd never once designed a space that reflected who I'd become. Until now, I started with a single page in my sketchbook. At the top I wrote, "The House of Quiet." It wouldn't be grand. No sharp angles, no glass towers, no marble or steel. Just stone, wood, and air. 3 elements that didn't compete, only cooperated. A studio that looked out toward the sea. A reading nook where morning light would fall exactly once a day. A courtyard without symmetry, open to rain. I wanted it imperfect. Because for the first time in my life, imperfection felt like honesty. I didn't hire a team. No engineers, no apprentices, no investors. Just local craftspeople, men and women who worked with their hands and didn't care about the hail name. When I told them I didn't want blueprints, just sketches, they laughed. One of them, a mason named Elio, said, "Most architects want to control the sky. You just want to listen to it." I smiled. You understand more than half my colleagues ever did. We started building in spring. The first weeks were slow. We reclaimed wood from old barns, stones from nearby quarries, and tiles from demolished farmhouses. Every piece had a history, every scar a story. Elio would sometimes catch me tracing the cracks on a beam or running my fingers over a weathered wall. He'd grin. "You're measuring time, not distance." "Maybe they're the same thing," I said. As the months passed, the house began to grow like something organic, quiet, humble, intentional. No symmetry, no forced beauty, just presence. The main hall had no doors, only thresholds, spaces that invited you but never demanded you enter. In the courtyard, I planted olive trees, lavender, and a single rose bush. Evelyn had once said roses were proof that beauty could defend itself. I thought she'd like that one. One morning, Leah visited. She stood in the doorway, eyes wide. "You're building again," she said. "Not for the world this time," I said. She looked around, admiring the unfinished walls. "It's different. Warmer. Softer." "So am I," I said. She smiled. "You look happy." Do I? Yes, she said. For a man who spent his life chasing perfection, you've finally learned to stop chasing. I chuckled. Turns out peace has terrible PR. After she left, I sat in the courtyard for hours, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the half-built rooms. It didn't echo anymore. It breathed. That was when I knew I wasn't just building a home. I was building an autobiography in stone. Each wall represented something I'd learned too late. Each window, something I'd finally let go of. And the open courtyard? That was forgiveness. Carved into the earth. By autumn, the structure was complete. No ceremony, no announcement. Just me and Elio, standing in the golden light, looking at what we'd made. He handed me a small plaque, hand-carved, uneven. "What's this?" I asked. He smiled. "Every builder deserves a cornerstone." I read the words aloud. "For the man who learned that walls can breathe and silence can speak." I looked up at him. "You're a poet, Elio. Poets build slower," he said, "but their work lasts longer." That night, I slept in the new house for the first time. No city hum, no traffic, just the sound of wind brushing the olive trees, the scent of wood and rain. I dreamt of Evelyn. She was standing in the garden, sunlight dripping through her hair like gold threads. She smiled and said, "You finally built something that doesn't need to be admired." When I woke, the morning light fell perfectly through the eastern window just as I'd drawn it. For the first time in my life, I didn't reach for a pencil. I just sat there and let the light move across the floor until it disappeared. Weeks later, I received a letter from Isabella. Inside was a photograph, a group of new architects standing in front of the sanctuary's latest addition, the Learning Pavilion. They'd inscribed something along the outer wall. I squinted at the image and read the words aloud, "Inspired by Marcus Hale's House of Quiet." I laughed softly, shaking my head. I hadn't even finished one chapter before the next began without me. That, I realized, was the true meaning of continuation. Now, I live simply. I grow vegetables. I teach local students who find their way here. No tuition, no credits, just curiosity. Sometimes, one of them will ask why I never patented my designs, or why I gave everything away. I tell them, because beauty isn't ownership, it's participation. They usually don't understand yet, but someday, they will. As winter settles in, I light a fire and sit by the window, the sea murmuring beyond the cliffs. The air smells of salt and cedar. In my sketchbook, one page remains blank, the last one. I write a single line at the top. Every building is a confession. Then I close it and place it on the shelf. Outside, the wind shifts. I can almost hear Evelyn's laughter in the distance, soft, content, unburdened. I whisper, "I'm home." And for the first time, the walls answer back in silence. Peace, I learned, doesn't mean isolation. It just means no one's knocking until someone does. It was a cold January morning when I heard it. 3 firm knocks against the oak door of the House of Quiet. Not hurried, not hesitant, intentional. When I opened it, I expected a courier, maybe one of the local students dropping off supplies. Instead, a woman stood there, elegant coat, calm poise, eyes I hadn't seen in over 20 years. "Leah," I said. She smiled softly. "You still answer your own door. Some habits refuse to retire." She stepped inside, glancing around at the warm wooden interior. "So this is it," she said. "Your final masterpiece." "Hardly a masterpiece," I said. "Just a home." "That's what makes it one," she replied. We sat by the fireplace. I poured tea, watching her eyes wander across the walls bare except for a single sketch. Evelyn's first drawing of the sanctuary, framed in reclaimed wood. Leah looked at it for a long moment. "She'd have loved this place. She would have redesigned it," I said. Leah laughed. "True." Then her expression softened. "It's been a long time, Marcus." "It has." She took a slow breath, her tone turning deliberate. "I didn't come here just to reminisce." I assumed not. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, old, weathered, bound with string. She placed it on the table between us. "What's that?" I asked. She hesitated. "Evelyn's journal. The one she kept after Lisbon. The one no one knew about." I froze. "Where did you get it?" "It was found in the Foundation archives during a renovation. hidden behind one of her old models. I stared at the folder, my pulse quickening. Why bring it to me? Because you were the only unfinished chapter in her story, Leah said quietly. I didn't open it right away. For a long moment, I just stared at the rough brown cover, as if it might dissolve if I blinked. Leah watched me carefully. There's something in there she wanted you to see. She wrote about you, about the sanctuary, about the life you both built and unbuilt. I nodded, still silent. Marcus, she said softly. I think she meant for this to find you. Eventually. I looked up at her. And you waited 10 years to bring it? I waited until you were ready to read it. After she left, I sat alone in the flickering light of the fire, the journal untouched on the table. Hours passed before I finally untied the string and opened it. Her handwriting hit me like a scent from another life, clean, elegant, deliberate. At the top of the first page, she'd written, Lisbon, 2016. For Marcus, when words are all that's left of us. I exhaled slowly and began to read. Asterisk. The sanctuary is more than architecture. It's an apology turned inside out. Every line we drew became a confession. We were too proud to speak aloud. I used to think Marcus was building to atone, but I see now that he was building to understand. We were never rivals. We were reflections, his sharpness, my softness, his control, my chaos. Together, we were balance, but we mistook balance for battle. Asterisk. My throat tightened. I turned the page. He doesn't know that I forgave him long before he asked. I just needed him to find his own language for forgiveness first. I set the journal down and rubbed my face, eyes stinging. I hadn't expected tears. But there they were, small, unannounced, honest. The entries continued design notes, sketches, reflections, fragments of poetry. Then, near the middle, one passage stopped me cold. If he ever reads this. Marcus, don't finish the sanctuary. Complete yourself. Whatever you build next, build it to be inhabited by silence, not ghosts. If you do, you'll finally know peace. And so will I. I laughed softly through the tears. Too late, Evelyn, I whispered. I already did. But the truth was, reading her words filled the silence in my home with her again, alive, articulate, infuriating, brilliant, and beneath it all, love quiet, mature, undefended. At the very back of the journal was a folded sheet of tracing paper, a small sketch unfinished, like most of her late work. It showed a small circular structure built into the hillside, open to the sea. Beneath it, she'd written 2 words, The Listener. I stared at it for a long time. A part of me understood instantly. It wasn't just a design. It was a message. Her final collaboration, an unspoken invitation. The next morning, I walked down to the edge of the cliffs where the sea met the rocks. The wind was sharp, cold enough to wake the bones. And there, I saw it, the perfect spot. The land dipped slightly, a natural hollow overlooking the waves. I could almost imagine it already built. A small circular room of stone and glass, half buried in the earth, open to the horizon. No walls to hide behind. No ceiling to trap sound. Just a place where one could listen to wind, to waves, to the ghosts that speak only when you stop interrupting them. Evelyn had drawn the idea. But maybe it was always meant for me to build. That evening, I sat at my desk and began sketching again. Lines flowed easily, naturally, without the strain of ambition or the weight of approval. Each curve felt like closure. Each shadow, like a breath. I didn't design The Listener to impress anyone. It would never appear in journals or award lists, but it would exist quietly, faithfully, like everything that had mattered most in my life. Later, as the fire burned low, I reread the final entry in Evelyn's journal. We are not defined by what we complete, but by what we begin and trust others to finish. I closed the book and looked around the room she'd never seen. The house of quiet seemed to glow in the firelight as if it understood. I whispered, All right, Evelyn. One last project. The wind outside picked up, whistling softly through the olive trees, like applause only the dead could give. And I smiled because it felt like permission. I started building The Listener in spring. No ceremony, no plans filed with councils, no press releases. Just me, Elio, and the sea. The land curved downward toward the cliffs, a natural amphitheater carved by time. That was where Evelyn had imagined it, though she'd never stood here herself. It felt right. She'd always been drawn to the kind of places that remembered silence before sound. The first stone went in quietly. Elio and I worked side by side. No words needed. He understood what this was. Not a commission, not a project. It was an offering. The structure was simple, almost primitive. A circular wall, low and open to the horizon. A roof that curved like a whisper, half glass, half sky. Inside, a single stone bench facing the sea. No ornamentation, no plaques, no doors to close behind you. It was meant for listening to wind, to waves, to memory. When the foundation was complete, I sat there for hours, alone. The ocean thundered below, waves colliding with the rocks in slow, steady rhythm. Every crash felt like punctuation, the sea finishing sentences I hadn't started. I thought of Evelyn, of the first time we'd argued over form versus feeling. She'd thrown her pencil across the room and said, "You're too afraid of chaos to notice it's where beauty lives." I smiled. Now, here I was, building chaos into permanence. Weeks turned to months. The listener rose slowly each day, adding texture, sound, and silence. Sometimes, locals would wander by, curious. Most thought it was a monument. Some thought it was a folly. One boy asked if it was a temple. I told him, "Only if you believe in listening." He grinned and ran off down the beach. I envied him. Children understand reverence instinctively. Adults have to rebuild it. One afternoon, while we worked, Elio looked up from his trowel. "You're not building for her anymore," he said. I paused. "What do you mean?" "You're building for yourself now. That's why it feels lighter." I studied the half-finished wall, the curve of shadow moving across it. He was right. For years, everything I'd built had been a translation of grief. This was the first time it felt like language, not apology. By midsummer, the listener was nearly complete. The stone was smooth under my hands, warm from the sun. Inside, the air carried a strange calm, like being inside an echo that hadn't happened yet. Leah visited again. She stood in the center of the chamber, eyes closed, breathing in the salt air. "It's alive," she said. "It's listening," I replied. She smiled, tears glinting. "It's what she wanted, isn't it?" I nodded. "It's what we needed." She looked at me for a long time. "When it's finished, what will you do?" I shrugged. "Maybe finally stop finishing things." That night, I stayed long after sunset. The moon rose, silver light spilling through the open roof. The sea shimmered like a sheet of broken glass. I spoke aloud to no one in particular. "If you can hear me, Evelyn, this is yours as much as mine." A gust of wind swept through, sharp and clean, filling the chamber with a deep hum. It sounded almost like a sigh, the kind that carries relief instead of sadness. And in that moment, I believed she heard. By early autumn, it was done. The listener. It wasn't large, it wasn't monumental, but it was perfect in its purpose. When you stood inside, sound disappeared, not completely, but gently. The world dimmed, the waves became heartbeat, the wind became breath. People began to come. Not tourists, but seekers, locals, travelers, artists, widows, lovers. They'd sit on the stone bench for minutes or hours, leave small offerings on the wall shelves, folded notes, bits of sea glass. No one spoke inside. It wasn't a rule. It was instinct. One morning, I found a note wedged in a crack near the entrance. It was written in careful handwriting. "I came here angry. I'm leaving quiet." That was all. No name, no signature. I read it twice, then left it where it was. Some things shouldn't be removed. A week later, Adrian arrived unannounced. He stood on the edge of the cliffs, his hair wind-tossed, his suit coated in salt spray. "I heard rumors," he said. "Thought I'd see if they were true." "They are." He walked inside, looking around in awe. "This isn't architecture," he said softly. "It's prayer." I smiled. "Prayer's just design without deadlines." He laughed quietly, then grew serious. "I brought something." He handed me a small box cedar, polished smooth. Inside was a fragment of the original sanctuary floor tile. He'd inscribed it with 2 words, "We listen." I placed it into the stone wall, just beneath the bench. It fit perfectly. We sat there in silence, side by side, listening to the sea. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Then Adrian said, "You think she'd be proud?" I didn't hesitate. "She'd say it took me long enough." He smiled. "You know, they're teaching your life now at the fellowship. God help them. It's not hero worship," he said. "It's philosophy. They call it the ethics of becoming." "Becoming what?" He looked at me. "Human." When he left, I stayed in the listener until the tide rose high enough that the spray reached the outer stones. It sounded like applause again. Soft. Endless. I sat on the bench, eyes closed, letting the rhythm of the sea fill the silence. And for the first time since Evelyn's death, I didn't think of loss. I thought of continuity. Because the listener wasn't a monument to grief. It was a collaboration between time and love. Between what's gone and what remains. And I finally understood her last line in the journal. We are defined not by what we complete, but by what we begin and trust others to finish. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered to the empty room, "It's finished, Evelyn, but it'll never end." The wind answered softly, swirling through the chamber, carrying her name out toward the open sea. And for once, I didn't chase it. I just listened. I never meant for the listener to become famous. I built it to be quiet, a secret kept between wind and stone. But secrets, I've learned, have wings. It started with a traveler's blog, then a photograph in a magazine, then a video, a woman crying quietly on the bench as the sea thundered around her. Within months, people began arriving from all over. Not tourists, pilgrims. They came carrying loss, love, confusion, hope, all the unspoken things human beings carry like hidden architecture beneath their ribs. And the listener took it all in. I watched from a distance at first, from the hill above, through binoculars, like a man guarding a miracle he didn't trust. Families visited at sunrise, widowers at dusk, young lovers in the rain. They didn't come to take photos. They came to leave something behind. Notes tucked in cracks, songs whispered to the wind, stones arranged in circles like small prayers. It wasn't mine anymore. It never really had been. One morning, I walked down to the cliffs just after dawn. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of salt and rosemary. A young woman sat alone inside the listener. Her shoulders trembled, quiet sobs she wasn't trying to hide. I didn't approach, didn't interrupt. I just waited until she stood, brushed tears from her face, and turned to leave. When she saw me, she froze. "Are you the caretaker?" she asked. "In a way," I said. She smiled faintly. "I don't know who built this, but it feels alive. It listens," I said. "That's what makes it alive." She nodded. "I told it things I've never told anyone. Then it's doing its job." She hesitated. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she walked away, her silence more eloquent than any gratitude. As the years went on, the listener became something unexplainable. Academics studied its acoustics. Psychologists wrote papers about its therapeutic resonance. Spiritual leaders called it a neutral cathedral. But to the people who came, it was simply what they needed it to be. A place to forgive, a place to remember, a place to breathe. And to me it became proof of a truth I'd spent my whole life resisting. We build to communicate with what words can't reach. Adrian visited again, older now, a few gray strands in his hair, but still with that same spark. He brought his daughter, a curious 8-year-old with paint on her shoes. She ran circles around the structure, laughing as the echoes chased her voice. Adrian smiled. "She calls it the talking stone." "She's not wrong," I said. He nodded toward the sea. "They're talking about replicating it, building listeners in other countries. Japan, Argentina, Morocco." I smiled. "Then it's finally doing what it was meant to." He looked at me. "You're not afraid it'll lose its meaning?" "No," I said. "Meaning isn't fragile. Ownership is." He chuckled. "You've gotten wiser." Just quieter. By the 10th anniversary of the listener, thousands had visited. The surrounding town had changed to cafes, art studios, small guest houses. But it wasn't exploitation. It was evolution. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of life blooming from silence. Musicians recording at dawn. Painters capturing the shifting light. Children playing on the cliffs. It wasn't a monument anymore. It was a community. One evening, a journalist came younger than Clara had been, even more earnest. He asked, "Did you ever imagine it would become this?" I smiled. "If I had, it wouldn't have." He frowned slightly. "You mean you didn't plan it?" "Some things have to grow beyond your imagination," I said. "That's how you know they were real." He scribbled the line down, then asked, "Do you ever feel like it's not yours anymore?" "It never was mine. It was hers." I paused. "And now it's theirs." He nodded slowly. "Would you say this is your greatest work?" I looked toward the sea, where the light shimmered through the open roof. "No," I said. "It's my quietest. And that's better." The years kept passing. Visitors came and went. And I, too, began to slow. My hands trembled when I drew. My breath shortened when I climbed the path to the cliffs. But the stillness inside me that remained solid. Every week, I still went to the listener. Sometimes to clean. Sometimes just to sit. And every time, I discovered new markings on the wall. People had carved messages, left initials, drawn spirals. Normally, I'd have despised defacement. But here, it felt right humanity, leaving its fingerprints on silence. One winter evening, as the sky bruised into violet, I sat alone inside the chamber. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was only calm. I closed my eyes and listened. The sea, the wind, the faint hum of the world breathing. And then, something else, a whisper, almost too soft to catch. Maybe just whined through the stone. Maybe something more. It said, "We hear you." I opened my eyes. The room was empty, yet somehow full. And I realized the structure wasn't listening to me. The world was. By spring, letters began arriving again. Not for Marcus Hale, but for the listener. Messages from people who'd never met me. I left my father's ashes there. It was the first time I felt peace. I proposed there. She said yes. I came to say goodbye to someone I couldn't forgive. I left forgiven. I kept every letter in a wooden box beside my bed. Not as trophies, as proof that silence can still speak. Adrian visited one last time that year. He found me sitting by the cliffs, sketchbook on my lap. "You're still drawing," he said. "Habit," I said. "I like to see if my hands remember." He smiled. "We've decided to dedicate next year's fellowship to Evelyn's final works. We want to exhibit your sketches too." I shook my head. "No exhibitions, just stories." He nodded. "Then we'll tell them." He hesitated. "You know, they call you the listener's architect now." I laughed softly. "Then they've misunderstood it. I didn't build the listener, I heard it." That night I walked down to the chamber one last time before sleep. The stars stretched endless above, reflected in the black water below. I sat on the bench, my fingers resting on the smooth stone. "This is how I'd like to be remembered," I whispered. "Not as a man who built, but as one who finally learned to listen." The wind rose, carrying the scent of salt and lavender, and, as it passed through the opening in the roof, the air hummed softly, not loud enough to call music, but enough to call peace. I smiled, because for the first time, the silence didn't feel like the absence of sound. It felt like the presence of understanding. The older I grew, the slower mornings became. Coffee cooled before I could finish it. Sunlight lingered longer on the window pane. Even the sea, once a roaring, impatient thing, now sounded like a heartbeat I'd finally learned to keep pace with. The house of quiet was still, the air thick with salt and memory. I'd grown used to solitude, though sometimes I caught myself talking to the walls, not out of madness, but out of gratitude. They always listened. I'd stopped drawing months ago, not because I couldn't, but because I no longer needed to. Everything I ever wanted to say was already built. Standing on a cliff, listening to the world in my place. The listener. The doctor came twice a week now. Kind man, gentle voice, never overstayed. He'd ask, "Any pain today, Mr. Hale?" And I'd always answer, "Only the kind that reminds me I'm still here." He'd smile, make his notes, and leave with the smell of antiseptic trailing behind him. I knew what he didn't say. That my heart, like my buildings, had been under too much pressure for too long. That the body, unlike architecture, doesn't get to rebuild itself endlessly. And I was all right with that. One morning, Adrian visited alone. He looked older, hair silver at the temples, eyes tired but kind. He stood in the doorway, hesitant. "I heard you weren't feeling well," he said. "I've been better, But I've also been worse, I said, smiling. He laughed quietly. You still joke about mortality. It's easier than ignoring it. He sat beside me by the fire. For a while, we didn't talk. Just the crackle of wood and the whisper of waves through the open window. Then he said softly, They've built 5 new listeners now, around the world. I know, I said. People send me photos. They want to dedicate them all to you. I shook my head. Dedications are just names on walls. Better to dedicate them to silence. He nodded slowly. I'll make sure of it. He hesitated. Then said, Do you ever think about what happens after? All the time, I said. And I've come to a conclusion. He raised an eyebrow. Which is, that buildings don't die. They just wait for new meanings. After he left, I walked slowly to my study. The light came in soft through the west window, the same way it had the day I finished The Listener. On my desk lay a blank sheet of paper. I sat, picked up a pen, and began to write. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a confession. It was something else, a message to whoever would find it when I was gone. I titled it simply, The Listener's Creed. And I wrote, We build not to last, but to belong. Every wall must breathe. Every silence must speak. Listen before you design. Understand before you create. Forgiveness is architecture. Grace is foundation. Legacy is not memory. It is motion. And when your hands can no longer build, let your silence build for you. I set the pen down. The ink bled slightly into the paper grain, imperfect. Human. I liked that. That evening, the wind was high. The sound of the sea reached all the way up the hill, brushing through the open windows. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sat outside under the olive trees. The sky was streaked in orange and rose. The horizon seemed closer somehow, as if the world was folding gently inward. I thought of Evelyn, her laughter, her temper, her brilliance, of Leah, Adrian, Isabella, of every student who'd ever looked at me and seen not a teacher, but a warning. And I thought of her final words in her journal. We are defined not by what we complete, but by what we begin. She'd been right, of course. She always was. I had spent my life finishing things. But it was what I began: forgiveness, silence, listening that would live on. That night, I dreamt again. Evelyn was there, standing in The Listener, wind moving through her hair. She smiled, that same half-smile, the one that always preceded both trouble and brilliance. You took your time, she said. Would you have preferred I rushed? She laughed. No. You finally built something without expecting applause. We stood in silence, the sea murmuring below us. Is it enough? I asked. She looked at me, eyes full of the sky. More than enough. You turned noise into peace. And then she was gone. When I woke, dawn was breaking. The air was cool and still. I felt tired. But it wasn't weakness. It was completion. I reached for the creed on the desk and folded it carefully into an envelope. On the front, I wrote, To whoever listens next. Then I placed it inside the drawer, beneath my old sketchbook. The same one that held the first line I ever wrote as a young architect. Design is the art of listening to space. I smiled. Full circle, I whispered. Then I walked slowly, steadily down to The Listener. The sea was calm that morning. Mist drifted over the cliffs like a veil. Inside the chamber, light fell in perfect circles through the roof. I sat on the bench, hands resting on the cool stone. The air was warm, humming softly with the rhythm of waves below. I closed my eyes, and for a long time I just listened. To wind, to water, to silence. And somewhere inside that silence, I heard her again, not as a ghost, not as memory, but as understanding. Well done, Marcus. I smiled. Not proud, not triumphant. Just peaceful. The light grew softer, the sea louder, and I let the two sounds merge until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. That's how they found me later, seated peacefully, eyes closed, a faint smile on my lips. Years passed. The Listener still stood, stronger, even, weathered by time, softened by touch. One day, a student cleaning the House of Quiet found the envelope marked, To whoever listens next. They brought it to the foundation. And when the words were read aloud, They became the guiding philosophy of the fellowship, etched into every wall, printed in every journal, quoted in every lecture. They called it the listener's creed. And beneath it, in smaller letters, they engraved the final line Marcus Hale ever wrote: "When you stop needing to be heard, the world finally listens."